In the shadows of independence, a bullet silenced a revolutionary. Who killed Pio Gama Pinto and why? Join us as we dive into Kenya's first political assassination. Don't forget to subscribe to support our work. This is Dark Echoes 254.
Dark Echoes 254.
It took a while before one began to realize that things weren't quite right.
Wacha kuhuzika, kwanza hata sikumjua. Mimi nilitumika kama scapegoat.
Pio Gama Pinto was born on March 31st, 1927 in Nairobi, Kenya, into a family of Goan Catholic descent. His father was employed in the colonial administration while his mother tended to the home, raising him with the values of discipline and faith. At the age of 8, Pinto was sent to India for his education, a journey that would shape the ideological foundation of his future activism. He spent his formative years in Goa and later in Bombay Presidency, regions pulsing with anti-colonial energy as India's struggle for independence intensified. During his teenage years, Pinto joined Kenyatta College in Dawar, enrolling in science courses. But it was the social and political turmoil of the time that captivated him more than textbooks. In 1944, at just 17 years old, he joined the Royal Indian Air Force as an apprentice ground engineer. His time in the Air Force instilled in him a technical discipline and organizational rigor that would later support his activist work. After leaving the military, he briefly worked with the Bombay Post and Telegraph Department, but he was soon drawn back into the urgent cause of liberation. Pinto's political awakening truly ignited during this period. Outraged by the ongoing Portuguese colonization of his native Goa, he co-founded the Goa National Congress, which advocated for Goa's independence from Portuguese rule. He quickly became involved in organizing protests and rallies, activities that put him on the radar of the Portuguese authorities. A warrant was issued for his arrest, forcing him to flee India and return to Kenya in 1949. He came back not as a passive migrant, but as a politically sharpened firebrand, carrying with him the fierce spirit of India's anti-colonial resistance. Upon his return, Pinto took up clerical position, first with the East African Railways and later with private firms, but his true calling lay elsewhere. He turned to journalism as a tool of resistance, contributing to the Daily Chronicles, Colonial Times, and broadcasting for All India Radio Swahili service. Pinto also helped establish Uzword, a Goan language newspaper, as a means of political mobilization with the Indian diaspora. In 1951, he co-founded the East African Indian Congress, a body aimed at politically organizing the Indian community in solidarity with African nationalists. Pinto's work increasingly aligned with his African liberation efforts, and he became an outspoken advocate for the Mau Mau uprising, land redistribution, and workers' rights. His politics were firmly rooted in socialism and Pan-African unity. He believed that liberation would be incomplete if it merely transferred power from European colonizer to a local elite without addressing inequalities and injustice. Pinto's early life is a compelling portrait of a transnational resistance. From a disciplined apprentice in the Royal Indian Air Force to a fiery anti-colonial journalist in Kenya, every step of his journey was marked by a refusal to submit to empire. He became a bridge between continents, people, and struggles, laying the groundwork for his later role as a Kenyan most visionary and ultimately martyred freedom fighter. By the early 1950s, Pio Gama Pinto had become a thorn in the side of the British colonial regime in Kenya. His unwavering support for African liberation, his Pan-African socialism, and his unapologetic alliance with the Mau Mau uprising had made him a target. He wasn't just a writer or political organizer anymore. He was a threat to the empire. In 1952, when the colonial government declared a state of emergency following the rise of the Mau Mau rebellion, Pinto was amongst the many activists, thinkers, and trade unionists swept up in the mass arrest. Unlike others who tried to mask their sympathies, Pinto was bold and direct in his support for the freedom fighters. He had publicly criticized the British administration for its brutal land policies, its racist segregation, and its violent suppression of African voices. To the colonial government, he wasn't just an Indian dissenter. He was a dangerous connector between African rebels and global anti-imperialist sentiment. That made him even more dangerous. He was arrested without trial under emergency regulations and detained for nearly 4 years. The first phase of his imprisonment began in Manda Island, a remote and punishing detention site off the Kenyan coast, where political prisoners were isolated and silenced. The conditions were dehumanizing. Detention without trial meant no legal defense, no due process, just indefinite punishment for holding radical ideas. Pinto, already a man of strong conviction, found the isolation psychologically grueling, but he remained intellectually resilient. He reportedly used his time in Manda to reflect, read and write, often encouraging other detainees to keep hope alive and remain committed to the cause. His calm resistance and dignity under harsh conditions gained him quite reverence among both Africans and Indian political prisoners. After Manda, he was transferred to another detention site, including a camp in Rift Valley where restrictions remained strict and movement limited. But not even colonial chains could silence his ideology. Even behind barbed wire, Pinto's reputation grew. His name circulated in whispers among underground cells in Nairobi, Kisumu, and Mombasa. His wife, Emma, and close comrades lobbied tirelessly for his release, framing him not as a criminal but as a prisoner of conscience. The longer he stayed locked away, the more evident it became that Pinto wasn't a man defeated by captivity. He was a man tempered by it. He was finally released in 1959, almost 4 years after his initial arrest, and what emerged from detention was not a broken man, but a sharper, more strategic revolutionary. Instead of retreating into silence, Pinto walked out of prison with renewed fire and immediately resumed his work. He started organizing again, speaking out against colonial capitalism and mentoring a younger generation of activists through his writing and political networks. Detention had only deepened his resolve. In trying to cage him, the British had unwittingly turned him into a symbol, living proof that true revolutionaries cannot be silenced with handcuffs or island prisons. When Pio Gama Pinto walked out of detention in 1959, he was not the same man that colonial government had tried to silence. The prison camp had stripped him of time and freedom, but not his spirit. If anything, captivity had hardened his resolve and deepened his ideological clarity. He had entered detention a committed revolutionary. He emerged a visionary tactician. The Kenya he returned to was simmering with unrest and anticipation. The wind of independence was gathering speed, and Pinto immediately positioned himself not on the sidelines, but at the heart of the coming transformation. He began working behind the scenes with a fervor that startled even his closest comrades, determined to ensure that the freedom Kenyans fought for would be more than symbolic. It had to be rooted in justice, equity, and socialism. He resumed his journalism, writing fiercely anti-imperialist columns in several outlets, often targeting neocolonial interests and warning against the rise of capitalist elites poised to inherit the colonial machine. But more than anything, Pinto became a master organizer, a political architect. He was instrumental in the creation of Sauti ya KANU, the voice of KANU, the official newspaper of the Kenya African National Union. Through his platform, Pinto helped shape the ideological narrative of the independence movement, pushing KANU towards leftist, pro-people's policies. He didn't just want a flag change, he wanted land reform, workers' rights, and wealth redistribution. He wanted the revolution to be real and irreversible. His home became a hub for resistance and education, from trade unionists and journalism to ex-Mau Mau fighters and youth leaders. Pinto mentored a wide range of revolutionaries. He shared reading materials, helped draft speeches, and connected them to global liberation struggles in India, Algeria, Ghana, and Cuba. He was deeply involved in creating the Lumumba Institute, named after the assassinated Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, which trained young KANU party cadres in socialist theory, anti-imperialist strategy, and disciplined political organization. Pinto saw the Lumumba Institute as the seedbed of a truly revolutionary Kenyan state, one that wouldn't be hijacked by tribalism, foreign capital, or Western manipulation. Anti-imperialist strategy and disciplined political organization. Pinto saw the Lumumba Institute as the seedbed of a truly revolutionary Kenyan state, one that wouldn't be hijacked by tribalism, foreign capital, or Western manipulation. But even as he worked tirelessly for the masses, he grew increasingly wary of the direction the new Kenyan leadership was taking. A rift had begun to form within KANU, between the capitalist-leaning moderates led by Jomo Kenyatta and the left-wing radicals aligned with figures like Oginga Odinga. Pinto, a devout Marxist and Pan-Africanist, naturally found himself in the radical wing. He feared that independence without structural change was a betrayal, that the new black elites would simply step into the boots of the colonial masters. He warned of a Kenya where the poor remained poor, where white settlers kept the stolen lands, and where imperialism wore a local face. Despite rising threats and political tension, Pinto refused to retreat. He had sacrificed too much to be silenced now. He continued to write, organize, and push for revolution until the morning of February 24, 1965, when he was gunned down outside his home. His murder just 2 years after independence sent shockwaves across the continent, but those who truly understood him knew Pio Gama Pinto had not died in vain. He had lived exactly as he believed, dangerously, courageously, and unbending in his love for the oppressed. The morning of February 24, 1965 began like any other in Pinto's household. The sun was still rising over Nairobi when Pio Gama Pinto stepped outside his home in Westland to drive his young daughter to school. He was a man of routine, early riser, newspaper reader, meticulous planner. But on that morning, history had another plan for him. As he walked towards his car, a blue Peugeot parked in his driveway. He was unaware that two men lay in wait. One of them, armed with a pistol, stepped forward and fired. The sound shattered the stillness of the neighborhood. Bullets ripped through Pinto's body and he collapsed beside the car, bleeding out in front of his daughter. The attack was swift. The assassins fled on foot, vanishing into Nairobi's dusty back streets, leaving behind a nation paralyzed by fear and confusion. Kenya had been independent for just over a year, and already the air was thick with betrayal and political anxiety. Pio Gama Pinto, a freedom fighter, journalist, and socialist strategist, had become the first high-profile political assassination in post-colonial Kenya, and almost immediately the state machinery kicked into gear, not to mourn, but to control the narrative. Within hours, a young man named Kisilu Mutua was arrested. The official version was that Kisilu was a petty criminal involved in a robbery gone wrong. But to Pinto's allies, friends, and widow, Emma, that explanation rang hollow. This was no random act. This was surgical, political, a message. Kisilu would later be convicted and spend 35 years in prison, but he always insisted he was innocent, a scapegoat for more powerful men. The real masterminds, many believed, were protected by the state. Behind the headlines and police reports, a darker truth brewed. Pinto had become too influential. He was the ideological backbone of Kenya's leftist movement, the man who guarded Vice President Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, who trained radical youths at Lumumba Institute and who fiercely opposed neo-colonialism. He criticized how Kenya's first leader, especially Jomo Kenyatta, were drifting into capitalist, pro-Western alliances that betrayed the dreams of Mau Mau and landless poor. Pinto believed independence without retribution was just colonialism in blackface, and that made him dangerous. He wasn't loud or fiery. He was methodical, connected and principled. He moved ideas, not mobs, but the ideas he planted were revolutionary. To those clinging to power, they were also threatening. His death then wasn't just an act of violence, it was political cleansing. The bullet that struck down Pio Gama Pinto didn't just pierce a man's body, it fractured a fragile nation. In the days following his assassination in February 24, 1965, Kenya was plunged into a fog of grief, fear, and quiet suspicion. Newspapers carried the headlines, but not the truth. The official narrative was thin: a robbery gone wrong, a petty thug arrested, justice supposedly served. But those who knew Pinto, who marched with him, organized beside him, whispered ideas into dark Nairobi streets, knew better. This was not random, this was surgical, a warning cloaked in gunfire. Pinto's funeral was thick with tension. Crowds gathered in silence, not just to mourn but to watch, to see who could come, who would not, and who dared to speak his name aloud. The air was raw with emotions. Jaramogi Oginga Odinga stood stiffly at the burial, stoic but shaken. His closest comrade had been executed in the open. A signal had been sent, and it was meant for him too. Behind the scenes, the traumas reached every corner of the ruling party, KANU. Pinto had been the ideological compass for Kenya's socialist left, and his death created a vacuum no one could fill. Within weeks, government forces began to move quietly but decisively against leftist institutions. The Lumumba Institute, Pinto's brainchild and training ground for radical youth, came under scrutiny. Whispers of communist indoctrination gave the government the pretext it needed to investigate, defund, and eventually shut it down. Odinga, already embattled, began to retreat from public confrontation. He calls for land redistribution, state control of key industries, and aligned with social states like China and the USSR became quieter. Without Pinto at his side, he was ideologically isolated. By the following year, Oginga would resign as vice president and form an opposition party, the Kenya People's Union, marking the formal split between Kenya's capital elite and socialist dreamers. Pinto's death had been the catalyst. For the public, the fallout brought confusion and silence. The hope that had lit the air after independence was replaced with unease. Political assassinations weren't supposed to happen in a free country, but now fear became policy. Writers grew cautious, organizers moved underground, the state grew more paranoid, more violent, and less apologetic. What began with Pinto would continue with others: Tom Mboya in 1969, Josiah Mwangi Kariuki in 1975, each killing a step deeper into repression. In the Indian Kenyan community, Pinto's death left a scar. He had been a bridge between Africans and Asians, a rare voice of unity in a country increasingly divided by class and tribe. Now that bridge lay in ruins. His widow, Emma Pinto, became a quiet warrior for justice, but the case was buried in bureaucracy. No independent investigation, no accountability, just one man, Kisilu Mutua, locked away and a country told to move on. In the months following Pio Gama Pinto's assassination, one of his most ambitious legacy began to crumble: the Lumumba Institute, a political training center named after Congolese freedom fighter Patrice Lumumba. The institute had been Pinto's brainchild, not just a school but a radical furnace. It was here that he hoped to shape a new generation of Kenya's revolutionaries, not just politicians, but ideologically armed cadres committed to justice, socialism, and Pan-African unity. Opened shortly before his death, the institution stood at the heart of KANU's youth wing, where young party members were drilled not in loyalty to personalities but in ideas: decolonization, land redistribution, anti-imperialism. But after Pinto's murder in February 1965, the vision had pulsed within the walls of the Lumumba Institute came under siege. To the western-leaning wing of Kenya's post-independence government, especially those loyal to President Jomo Kenyatta, the institute was not a school, it was a threat. Whispers of Marxist indoctrination and foreign communist funding began to swirl. The CIA, already watching Kenya closely, flagged the institution as hotbed of subversive activity. Western diplomats pressured the Kenyatta regime to rein it in, and with Pinto gone, the institution's fiercest defender and strategist, there was no one left within Kanu strong enough to fight for it. At the same time, Vice President Oginga Odinga, the institute's most high-profile patron, was losing political ground. The balance of power in Kanu tilted sharply to the right. Those in Kenyatta's inner cycle, like Tom Mboya, began publicly distancing themselves from anything that smelled of socialism or Soviet influence. Odinga's alignment with China and the USSR became a liability. The Lumumba Institute, once hailed as the ideological engine of KANU, was now framed as a subversive organ infiltrating the party with dangerous foreign ideologies. By mid-1965, just months after Pinto's death, the government quietly shut down the institution. No formal announcement, no hearing, just silence, the kind that follows political executions. The building was emptied, records disappeared, and the young minds being trained within it were scattered. Some went underground, others fading into the background, scared or disillusioned. A few defected to government ranks, abandoning the dream they once believed in. It was the end of a short, fiery experiment crushed by fear, betrayal, and a heavy hand of power. The collapse of Lumumba Institute marked more than the end of a school. It symbolized the death of the ideological revolution in Kenya's early years. The country's political future would now be shaped not in lecture halls or struggle sessions, but in smoky backroom deals, patronage, and politics of ethnic division. For those who remembered Pinto, his tireless organizing, his clarity of purpose, and his belief in the masses, the fall of the institute felt like the final confirmation that the revolution had been hijacked. What remained was independence in name and neocolonialism in practice. But even in ruin, the Lumumba Institute lived on, not in bricks or books, but in memory, in the quiet defiance of those who still whispered Pinto's name like a prayer in the fire he left behind. Pio Gama Pinto was silenced, but his questions still echo. Who profits from forgetting? Who fears the truth? If this story moved you, subscribe, share, help us keep digging. This has been Dark Echoes 254, where memory resists erasers. Until next time.